Hello, I hope you're having a great day today. In this lesson, we're going to look at Networks and Topologies Lesson 2, which is going to be Network Performance. So that's just this bullet point right here, factors that affect the performance of networks.
Look, our internet connection.
Mom! Never mind.
So network performance is concerned with how well data is transmitted through the network. And the main factors that we need to know about for our exams are the bandwidth of the network, the number of users, the transmission media used, the error rate, and latency. Bandwidth measures how much data can be transferred over a network in a given time. Often you'll hear it used interchangeably with speed, but bandwidth refers to capacity, not speed. Think about bandwidth as the size of the internet pipe, not the speed of the data passing along it. If you think about the example of a road, bandwidth measures how many cars are arriving every second, not how fast those cars are traveling. Bandwidth is usually measured in bits per second, what we refer to as the bit rate. You get kilobits per second, megabits per second, and gigabits per second. Notice we're talking about bits, not bytes here. So remember there are 8 bits in a byte, so that a connection of, say, 8 megabits only actually delivers 1 megabyte of data per second. That's why often the advertised speed of your ISP seems to be a lot faster than the speed you actually get. If they say, oh, your speed is 40 megabits per second, that means you can actually download about 5 megabytes per second. After bandwidth, the next thing we need to think about is the number of users, because after all, that bandwidth of the network is shared between the number of people using that network. You might see the term contention ratio being used, and that just means the ratio between the number of users and the available bandwidth. Remember, of course, that the bandwidth is not always shared equally. If someone on a network is streaming, for example, HD video or doing online gaming, they may use a large chunk of that bandwidth, leaving a lot less for the other users to share. Transmission or communications media is something that we looked at briefly in the last lesson, and that is what we're using to actually transmit the data through. So data can be carried around networks via cables or wirelessly, and the choice made can affect the overall performance of the network. Copper cables are often used for Ethernet cables on local area networks. There are lots of different types of Ethernet cable. More expensive cables carry more data and are shielded to prevent interference and things like that. Also, in some countries, we still use old copper telephone cables for wide area networks. And using copper for wide area networks isn't a very good idea. It really does limit the available bandwidth. Nowadays, we tend to use fiber optic cables for wide area networks. These provide exceptionally high bandwidth compared to older copper cables, but they are a bit more expensive. Essentially, with copper cables, you're transmitting an electrical signal down the copper, whereas with fiber optic, you've got these very, very thin glass tubes, and they're transmitting pulses of light. And obviously, light is the fastest thing that we have. Wireless technology, Wi-Fi, wireless fidelity, can also be used to transmit data over a local area network. Using Wi-Fi avoids the need to install cables and make alterations to buildings. It also allows easy connection of new devices. This is especially useful when visitors to an organization need to connect their portable devices to the local area network and perhaps they're on the internet as well. Wi-Fi typically has less bandwidth than Ethernet, however, and this can be a big problem if many users are sharing the same bandwidth. Wi-Fi network performance can also be affected by signal interference from other Wi-Fi networks, the thickness of walls and floors and ceilings, etc. Security is also a potential problem. Wireless signals can be intercepted very easily, so protective measures are needed, such as encryption. The next point we need to know about is the error rate. An error rate simply is the number of errors that occur during data transmission. So essentially the ones and zeros that are being transmitted might become flipped, so 1 becomes a 0 during transmission. Why do we have these errors? Well, we could have interference from other networks, weak Wi-Fi signals, other things that can happen that would corrupt the data. And finally, we're going to look at latency. Latency is a measure of how much time it takes for a packet of data to travel across the network. It is the delay that it takes to get from point A to point B. And this is a much closer representation of speed than, say, bandwidth. Latency usually isn't a problem for local area networks, as the nodes are all very close together. But latency can be a bigger problem on wide area networks such as the internet. As any of you who do online gaming know, your ping rate becomes very important. Remember, every cable, every switch, every router on the network adds a delay, latency, to the connection. In summary, network performance is how well data is transmitted through a network. The main factors that influence network performance are the bandwidth of the network, how much data can you receive at once, the number of users, so again, that's the bandwidth divided by the total number of users. So even a high bandwidth connection might seem quite slow if it's being shared between enough users. The transmission media used. Are we looking at copper cables, fiber optic cables? Are we using Wi-Fi? How is that data being transmitted? The error rate. Is something happening that's flipping those ones and zeros over and causing errors? And we also have to think about the latency, the delay in that data getting sent from point A to point B. Well, I hope that was useful for you. That's going to be me signing off for today. I'll see you in the next lesson.